All right, guys. I've went to get a facial, and this is how my face looks now. Ladies and gentlemen, the resurrection, a critical examination of the Easter story. I had his book permanently tattooed on my face, as you can see, and I hope everybody watching this goes and gets the tattoo on their face as well. You can get the tattoo in paperback as well as ebook. Okay, I'm kidding. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do a deep dive into the resurrection, the Easter story. I mean, did it even happen? I'm talking to myself 9 years ago. Of course it happened, I would say. Well, let's take a closer examination. In the first episode, if you haven't seen it, it's in the description. You can go back and watch it, where me and Jonathan M.S. Pierce we do a little preamble before we even deal with the resurrection. We're already letting you get your radar on, your spidey senses going. Be cautious. Stop before you just swallow the pill wholesale. You might want to ask yourself, is this heroin? Is this fentanyl? Is this methamphetamine? Is it a sugar pill? Are they trying to trick me here? Or is this actually helpful? And I just say that to say, be cautious with the story. And we're going to take a critical examination today into some details about the narrative of the Easter story. With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's time. Don't you think it's time that I go ahead and pop on the live? Let's see. Comparing Jesus to the other gods. Let's go ahead and do it. Here we go. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. We're dealing with the resurrection of Jesus, something I actually took upon myself as something I believed in. I had faith in. I actually trusted. This actually happened, and my experience of the Lord, really, if I was to be honest, was what kept me as part of the faith. It wasn't there was evidence. It was the way, I'm not going to say the word evidence is a bad word to use, because we could look at the Bible and say, well, that's our evidence. But what do you mean? Like, could we actually verify the claims? No, we couldn't. And so there was faith. Welcome to the chat, everybody. I'm paying attention to you guys. If you want to super chat questions along the way, we will try and take them. If for whatever reason it's not pertinent to the discussion, I'll hold it off to the end. I am going to screenshot them. And before we get started, Jonathan M.S. Pierce has a YouTube channel. Go subscribe. I really appreciate all those that go and subscribe to the people who join on my channel. It helps us all grow, educate each other, get familiar with each other's faces here. A tippling philosopher. He has many other books than the one we're dealing with today, which is The Resurrection. I'm going to let you guys see that a little further as we continue. He also has a blog where he talks about a lot of different things. I appreciate you guys checking out his blog and commenting, and maybe you could sign up, do all that good stuff. We also have the Patreon. If you guys want to join us and you have questions for scholars, you want me to interview in person, you want to personally harass me, I'm totally okay with that. I actually permit that on my Patreon, and I actually pay attention to those harassments. So lots of videos never been launched to the public are on here. You guys help keep me alive. And now let's get right into the content. No need to play games any further. Welcome to MythVision, Doctor. About to call you Doctor. You know, I say that because last time someone actually called you Doctor.
It's a mistake, mate. Well, I'm excited. It's a pleasure and a privilege. I'm not the only one who's excited, actually. I have two just recently 11-year-old twins. One of them said, "Oh, are you getting interviewed by Cool Hair again?" And I was like, do you mean cool hair guy or the guy with cool hair? No, Cool Hair. So I was like, have you not seen this, Barnett? You know, less is more. But obviously, Obviously not. So he's excited anyway, and I'm excited. So and I hope people have checked out the first video. As you said, we did a lot of laying the groundwork. There's a lot of arguments that took on a philosophical nature and a theological nature before we then are hopefully going to start to look at some of the details of the resurrection.
I think so. Before we get started, I'd like to first thank a few super chats already out the gate. Troy Miller, thank you, my friend. I appreciate it. He says, party on. And look, I'm partying, baby. And you guys are too while tuning in. You're going to love this. I'm telling you, you're going to love this. Donna Badgero, I hope I'm saying that correct. Thank you. And they're super chatting. They said, because I love this show. Thank you so much. I appreciate the love you have for this channel and what we're doing to try and educate more people, to take a critical analysis of all of these religions, cults, books, you name it. So how is my audio level compared to Jonathan's? Let me know if I'm way too loud and if he's too low or something like that. This is about how I'm going to speak the rest of the show. I saw some complaints I meant about audio level differences. So in the chat, everyone tell me, go ahead, Jonathan, if you would talk.
Yep. So this is me talking. This is about the level I will talk pretty consistently throughout the time. So yeah.
Okay. Waiting on some comments to make sure that these audio levels are about the same. And if they aren't, I can turn mine down a smidge if I need to.
So I don't know whether I can take this opportunity because going through the comments from the previous video, I think we talked, if those who watch it remember, we talked about the atonement and the general theology and philosophy of these incidents like these ideas like the atonement and Holy Trinity that are necessary for the resurrection to make sense, right? And someone in the comments said linked the atonement to original sin and the fall. And I thought it would be a good time to just point out one issue I have with original sin and this two-horned dilemma, which then, because if that's a problem, then again, it's a problem for atonement, which is again a problem for the resurrection. So the problem I see with the original sin is if Adam and Eve, and again, this is like the belief that Adam and Eve are real people, they're obviously mythological. I mean, just obviously so. But if you are of the literal bent where you think, okay, Adam and Eve definitely existed and they the fall happened to them, blah, 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 then you believe that Adam and Eve did something wrong and humanity is still being punished on account of the actions of Adam and Eve. Now, you have two options here. Either Adam and Eve are representative of humanity, which is to say I could take Derek out, right? And I could swap Derek in for Adam and Derek would have made the same choice, right? Which is to say, okay, fair enough. Any human in that situation would have made the same choices that Adam and Eve made and disobeyed God and so on and so forth. In which case, we have a problem here that God has made a faulty creation of humanity, because it doesn't matter who you're going to put in there, they're always going to make that bad decision. In which case, we're all being punished because of our faulty design, right? The other horn of the dilemma is if I took Derek and put him into Adam's position or Eve's position, and Derek didn't make that choice, in other words, Adam and Eve aren't representative of humanity, then we are being punished on behalf of the actions of people who are not representative of us. Am I making sense?
Yes.
So the original sin is a real problem because either we're being punished because we're a crap design, or we're being punished on account of the actions of people who are not representative of general humanity. And I don't really see a way out of that problem, which then means that, you then link that to the atonement, you then link that to the resurrection, and it all starts falling down. So I just thought I'd lay that one out early doors, if that's all right.
Yeah, no, I know you wanted to deal with that criticism at first. It was a comment. So by the way, Jonathan will be paying attention to comments, and hopefully most of you guys have compliments. If you have criticisms, feel free. I mean, we're open to this. This is what we're here for. I expect people to come on and say, no, you idiot atheist, don't know what you're talking. Of course, that's what they'll say. But this isn't just you talking. Your book is loaded with PhD, and like these are not just you saying. You actually engage with Habermas. You engage with like even the Christian apologist side and stuff.
Of course, and you have to. I mean, so this is very much like evolution. Like the irony for evolution denies is that it's all about performance feedback revision. Performance feedback revision. So we perform. Someone criticizes us. We adapt and improve. or we just say actually that criticism doesn't hold. So yeah, criticism is great. They help us to improve.
Absolutely. So now that you've done that, would you like to kind of, I guess, recap a little and emphasize the idea of theology for people? I think that's going to be a
theme.
So
the idea of the Gospels are theology, not history. So that is the theme, the motif that runs through all of the criticisms we'll be making from here on in, is that the Gospel writers weren't writing history. They were not recognized historians. They were writing, and we talked about all this before, the fact that they were writing with biases, with no recognized historiography. I could list some. So non-eyewitness accounts written anywhere, in unknown places at unknown times, a long time after the events, using no recognized historiographical methodology. They were recounting private conversations. We talked a little bit about that, which is incredibly dodgy if you're going to purport to be accurate, and in a time when people couldn't easily record stuff, then that's a huge problem. They don't talk about their sources, and they are written ex post facto, which means they already came to believe that Jesus was the Messiah or God, and then wrote an account, so on and so forth. So we established that these were essentially not good, reliable sources. And then we talked previously about this idea of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And we went through certain examples of this, and that's just indubitably the case, right? So in other words, to overcome the fact that we have a very low prior probability, we talked about how the before we look at any data, the chances of the probability of such a story, such a claim being true is very, very low. We have lots of rising gods, lots of divine stories and myths. None of those are true. So in order for this one to be true, it has to overcome that very low prior probability. It needs a huge amount of an extraordinary amount of extraordinarily good evidence.
Yeah.
So the question we're going to start looking at now is the data provided by the Gospels that extraordinarily good evidence? So we looked at the fact that obviously, as I've just said, the Gospels weren't particularly good sources. Now let's look at what they say.
And now, like some of those things, I'm just so we stay on track, because there's so much we're going to cover today in your book, as well as touching our bullet points that we put together here. You mentioned archaeological record, and it's almost like if you found the shoe of Pontius Pilate, that somehow proves Jesus rose from the dead. Or if you found out that there was a Caiaphas high priest and we know where he was buried, that proves Jesus existed and therefore was buried and therefore rose again from the dead. That's not great evidence. People are placed in historical times, but yet are potentially fictional, or at the very least extremely mythologized. And so here we are dealing with theology again versus history.
Yeah, it's a really good point that you brought up, and I brought up in interview with, I mean, you've interviewed him more times than I've had hot dinners, right? So Josh Boehm, so he talks a lot about this, which is the idea that if you found something that maybe showed that King David was a real historical person, just because you find some evidence of King David, it doesn't mean that therefore that all of the narratives that you find in the Bible about King David are therefore true. It just means that there was a guy called King David. So I mean, this goes back to the historical method. So if I can just lay out a few ideas about the historical method, there are 5 general things that you need to consider when you are historically evaluating. Bart Ehrman talks about this with regard to the resurrection. So the first one is, does the source match the archaeological record? This is quite difficult for the gospel narratives concerning the resurrection, because we don't really deal much with archaeology. We deal with burial methods and things known history, but we're not digging up stuff about Jesus, because Jerusalem was destroyed. There's nothing there is one thing. So in a tomb, they have found some bones fused with an iron nail, going through some bones to show that someone buried in a tomb was crucified. And Christians like to say this is proof that people who are crucified can be buried in tombs. Of course, that's not what it shows. It shows that, and there's a good reason why that's not the case. It shows that if you are crucified, and I said this last time, and you are then buried in a criminal's graveyard or criminal's necropolis, like grave tomb complex, then your family could retrieve your bones after a year when they're ritually purified, and then place them in a family tomb. And we're pretty sure that this is what that particular bone that was found shows, because the iron nail was fused to the bone. Now, if he was buried in a tomb straight away, that nail would have been taken out, right? But that nail has had fused over a year, so that when it was transferred to a family tomb, it was they couldn't release the nail from the bone because they were fused together. So this is an example of that, rather than archaeologically defending that a criminal could be buried in a tomb. So there is that. But that, so as far as the historical method goes, that's the first one. It's not really too relevant for now. Right. Are there multiple sources that tell the same story? We talked about this. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are not multiple sources. They're codependent. They depend on Mark, essentially. You've also got Paul, but Paul tells us virtually nothing. So at most, I would say you've got Paul and Mark giving us maybe two independent sources of evidence. Third part of the historical method is there a chance or a reason that the source is biased?
I wonder, no, there's no way. There's no way the Bible has a bias.
We talked the last time about the ideas of communicating, so writing or orally communicating. So your form, what you write, is defined by your audience and your purpose, right? Right. And your purpose, your objective. So what would you say the objective of the Gospels are?
To make you believe this is the chosen one. This is the Messiah. This is the Son of God. To me, that would be the whole purpose of writing these, is to convince the reader, whoever that might be, this is him. This is the guy we've been waiting for.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So therefore, we're dealing with persuasive literature, and persuasive literature is advertising, is propaganda, is all these types of literature that are not particularly known for their facticity, right? For being particularly factual in their approach. It's about convincing people to believe what you are trying to set out, right? Or what you are setting out. So therefore, they are going to be incredibly biased to be presenting Jesus in the best light possible for their target audience. So Luke will do that differently to Matthew because they have two different audiences, right? And this will affect what they write and how they write it. But essentially, are they biased? 100%. Of course they are. The fourth part of the historical method is how much time has passed between the event and the source. Now, Christians like to think it's not a lot of time, but actually, if you talk about, we talked about Mark being in maybe after 70 CE, after the destruction of Jerusalem, so you've still got 40 odd years. That's quite a long time. When you've got speech and when you've got narrative, this isn't. So people talk about oral traditions being really accurate in Jewish times. Yes, when you're doing sort of poetic writing, it depends upon your genre, but when you're telling narrative stories with speech and this and that, that's not the sort of thing that you verbatim say over and over. So I contest that, but also quite a bit of time has elapsed, especially if you talk about John in the early hundreds. These aren't written right at the time by eyewitness.
And anyone who watched Dr. Kip's documentary recently of Josh McDowell, the apologist, you can't walk away from that and think, okay, supposedly this guy in the 60s, 70s, I say 60s approximately, if I'm not mistaken, it could be the late 50s. This guy's up there in age. He's like over 80 now. His whole testimony hinges on the idea that he went out there as a fighter of Christ for 2 years to prove Jesus isn't true against Christians at his college for 2 years, traveling the world, which Kip points out, is like, dude, do you know how expensive it would have been to internationally fly in those days on aircraft? Anywho, he supposedly had all this money, and we find out at the end of the documentary, I'm not trying to ruin it, you really got to see it, I'm telling you, go to Dr. Kip's channel. But at the end of it, you come to find out the guy, like a couple months after he gets his research paper, is already accepting Christ and getting sent on a mission trip to Europe to preach. He was claiming that he was in these libraries, looking up these sources, which how would he know what they say? Does he read Greek? Does he know Latin? Does he know Aramaic? Does he know Hebrew? He doesn't know these languages at the time. So how's he going to know what it's saying? Is he going to the professor there saying, hey, I'm going to throw you $1,000 to spend weeks with me to tell me what these sources say? What's going on? So that all within a 40-year current contemporary, we can show his story changed. And this is a real guy who's already mythologized his story, claiming he's a man after the truth, telling you a fiction. in order to push a bias that Jesus is the truth and he proved it and all that kind of stuff.
It's the old classic. I used to be an atheist. You know, you get this from all sorts of different theists, don't you? Lee Strobel and blah blah blah. This is just all sorts of. I used to be an atheist. Some of my best friends are atheists. Like, yeah, whatever. But yeah, so the fifth part of the dimension to the historical method is what genre of writing is used. So we talked about this is very persuasive. So this is evangelizing, persuasive source. And again, this is not history. It's just not history. So the genre being used here, and like Christians will argue with this, of course, because they see it as a historical document. It is not. These are not historical documents. There's absolutely no recognized historiographical methods being utilized here. There's no discussion of sources. There's no, there's just nothing. What happens is you get what I call like the Sherlock Holmes idea, which is, it's like saying that Arthur Conan Doyle was writing history because he talked about London and real places in London. So therefore Sherlock Holmes is true. So therefore Luke Acts is true because they mention lots of places that actually exist, and they mention some people who actually exist. Well, that's not history. That's theology. That rather than being history scripturalized, it's scripture historicized. So it's creating scripture and then throwing in little nuggets of history to make it sound so much more plausible.
And for those who are watching, he is speaking of the Gospels and talking about the genre of the Gospels, just making sure you guys are aware. Now, he's not saying Pauline letters aren't. Yes. But even then you say the evidence in the Pauline letters don't really help us in terms of any historical basis for what Christ did, who he was, what he says, things like that. There's not really much there at all. So,
and if you remember from the last video, we talked about those are letters that he was the persuasive letters. So interestingly, it depends which letter you're talking about, but say the first letter to the Corinthians, the second letter, you are talking about him having an argument with the Corinthians, trying to persuade them of a particular understanding of resurrection, right? That would be the time. This is what we talked about. That would be the time to drop in. I know this because he told me and he saw it. And it was an empty tomb, and these people were at the crucifixion, and these people were at the empty tomb, and that's how I know that this is this kind of resurrection. He doesn't say anything at all, which then tells you that actually he didn't have that data, because if he had that data, he would have used it. Well, then I went on to argue that the empty tomb narrative didn't even exist. That started with Mark, and the reason we know that, well, we can surmise that is because then there was this period before Matthew, and Matthew had a counter argument against Jews who were saying the body was stolen. So that it looks like Paul didn't have the empty tomb, Mark invented it, and Matthew provided the counter arguments to Jewish counter arguments. That's pretty solid. So that was, I think, where we got to. It would be interesting to talk about verifiability. So this idea that the Gospels themselves weren't particularly. The audience of the Gospels weren't able to verify.
I'm checking the book out, by the way.
Yeah.
Just so anyone knows.
Yeah. So the issue here is some Christians claim that, Jews would have done this, they would have done that, and because there's no evidence of this, it must have been true, or they must have tried to verify it and it turned out to be true, or whatever. Now, it turns out that when you read Acts, for example, you find out that Richard Carey talks a lot about this in his book, Not the Impossible Faith, which is actually a fantastic book full of loads of really good historical nuggets about historical methodology. So, and he talks about these times in Acts where people, potential converts, are just asserted stuff and then they just believe. It's like, fair enough. Yeah, I'm now a Christian. And the only time that you have an actual court scene, you have these court scenes in Acts that people struggle to believe. So you have this weird scenario whereby people appear not to want to verify the things they are presented with, because verification wasn't really a thing. I mean, we're a much more skeptical bunch now because we've got the scientific method. We have society's moved on, but in those days you can understand that people weren't necessarily thinking about initially being skeptical to everything they hear.
See, people could read something, and I want Moshe to stick around today, and says, he's obviously a believer. You could tell by the way he's commenting, right? And I want you to stick around, sir. I'd appreciate you checking out what we have to say about the details, because it just sounds like you and me just don't want to believe. But I think this is an interesting point you bring up. In antiquity, I suspect people would read literature, and all it took for them to believe, as people today, is to read in the literature antagonism within the narrative, that someone is resisting, like Paul, resisting Christ. And then all of a sudden an intercession happens and Christ, why do you resist me? It puts the pressure on the reader to feel the tension. Then the one who was fighting against him all of a sudden has submitted and realizes, you know what, this is true. And the person reading it is somehow psychologically experiencing the very narrative that they're reading, to the point where they start to feel kind of like they're believing in what's actually happening here. Like, I see Christians do that. They'll read it to the point, just the literature convinces them.
Now they do. So if you're going back to the time here, we talk about contemporary audiences. 10% would have been literate, at a push. So 10% could read, 5% could read and write. So if you're talking about, I can read this here and verify that, no, most of the audience would have been being read this,
and
their
but
ability,
they're still receiving it.
But even the ability to even be skeptical in a literate way. So we've also got to remember that people think the people in the early church times had all four gospels. It's the idea that surely they would have noticed that there were contradictions throughout there at the time. No. These were put together hundreds of years later after council and council and council, right? At the time, you would have had a community that would have used the Gospel of Mark, a community that might have used, and bear in mind, Mark came first, so no one used any other Gospels up until they were actually written. And then at the time, the journeying community might have been using John, and then you might have a Lucan community and a Matthean community.
Then you get this guy who sees the problems and says, I'll make a diatessaron and combine all four.
But it wasn't until you put all four in the same place that people could even begin really to effectively go. And then even then you'd have to know how to really read and treat these documents like skeptically. But this comes a lot later. And by then, you've got a development in theology and stuff. But it's not as if the people at the time could be hugely skeptical and say, actually, I know that if you're reading out to me the Gospel of Mark, I know that Matthew said this, and that's in direct that's not going to have happened in the early church times. So the problems with verifiability are that travel was really, really expensive. So not only did they not want to verify, but they were also completely unable to do so. So the travel was very expensive and very time consuming. And it was often dangerous. Okay. So that was kind of out of the question. And that's, land or sea, because again, you're talking about communities that were often abroad here. Mail in any conventional sense was practically impossible, certainly from strangers. Library access was incredibly limited and of little use to the potential Christian convert. Given the near practical impossibility of foreign or distant travel from outside of Palestine, or even from far off places within Palestine, this leaves us with localized fact checking. But the skills of interrogating were not known, let alone implemented, especially given the in-group secretive nature of those early Christian sects. So you got this two-pronged issue that they didn't want to verify, and even if they could, they were completely unable to verify these facts. And you're presented with these persuasive documents,
right?
Is there any surprise that actually these weren't particularly challenged, and when they were challenged by Jews, we learn about Justin Martyr writing about Trypho. We hear about Celsus as Jewish polemicists who were writing against Christianity, but we only know of their writing because it's been destroyed or lost through the writings of early Christians. And so even that we're unaware of what a lot of the counter arguments that took place at the time were.
So real quick, we've got Nikolai says, according to Trobish and Carrier, the canon was put together already in 150 AD, not hundreds of years after. I already know that that's not the case. Now, the canon in terms of the texts were there, but it wasn't a canon until later. But also, I know this isn't the case because when you look in the 170s, who is the church father? The book of Revelation wasn't even part of it. They didn't even have that as officially part. They actually saw John the Revelator as a heretic early on. They did not accept this book. It was only later that it was brought in by at least 170 or later. So,
and even then, that's already 120 years after Jesus' death. So it's not 100 years later. That's literally 120 years later by the admission of the commenter there. So, already we have a large amount of time. And then you look at Mark and say, well, actually, the earliest manuscripts of Mark don't have, the ending of Mark. And so it's all what I'm trying to communicate here is that verification was particularly hard, and that's not good for the reliability of the sources, because in the earliest times when you could verify and you could try and sort these problems out, you were completely unable to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Good point. Does that all make sense to you?
Yeah. I mean, you can't verify it today, even with our science that we have now. There's no way to verify these claims as well. So,
and that's a problem with doing history when you're talking about, particularly when you're talking about miraculous events. And again, Bart Ehrman talks a lot about this. If you see his debates on the historicity of the resurrection, he's like, historians can't prove that miracles took place. All you can do is present a probability argument, and of course that supernatural claim is going to be the least probable explanation of events, just by using prior probability and just intuitive understanding of what miracles are. So right. It's a real problem it's a real problem to come away from reading the Gospels and say, do you know what? The Christian interpretation of these Gospels is the most rational and probable conclusion I can come to, because it's not. It simply isn't.
Interesting thing. I wish, like Joseph Smith, we had contemporaneous critics of the movement out the gate. I mean, the guy was still alive while critics were responding to him and his cult. I wish we had that for Christianity more, to be able to verify and say, what are other people saying about this, even around this time? So we knew more about its actual origins, which we have to peek behind blinders and guess. But even within the text, in some of the pastorals, Dr. Price points out in one of the spots, he says, "Brethren, these are not cleverly devised myths, as some would suppose." What? So he uses he's using a critical deconstruction idea here, where he's saying, why did it say that at all? Who thinks these are cleverly devised myths? Well, someone does. So don't listen to those guys. These aren't myths. It makes you go, are they myths? That's a question you should ask. But of course, being that the persuasive letters, they're trying to say these aren't. So the Christian will go, do you not accept what it says? It says they aren't. Don't you believe the words that are coming out of the text? And we're going, the reason it's even being said is because someone believes they are cleverly devised myths, and we just don't have those words. We don't have those people.
The problem is Christians don't build up to the Bible. I always talk about bottom-up reasoning. So this is why in philosophy, I'm really interested in what abstract ideas are made of, because there's no point talking about morality if you don't understand what an abstract idea is, because morality is ultimately an abstract idea. So if you don't understand the nature of the ontology of abstract ideas, you can't start talking about stuff up here. But if we sort of lay that onto, say, Christianity, you don't argue towards the truth of Christianity. All Christians start with the truth of Christianity and work backwards.
Yep.
So you are inculcated into a religion. You are inculcated into whatever denomination and sect that you belong to, and you go through childhood oftentimes, or you go through rituals, and you get embedded in this cultural milieu of your religion, and then you learn then you start arguing as to why it's true, and then you scrabble backwards and backwards and backwards, and it's like sticker upon band-aid upon plaster and then you're fixing stuff, and then you've just got this ball of band-aids, and you go, yeah, this is what I believe. Look at this Bible. It's just a big medical box. And whereas as a skeptic, you should be like, I'm not going to believe anything. I'm going to build up my worldview from the bottom up, and then I will go to wherever it leads me. I don't start with a conclusion and say, that's it, let's go backwards. I build up to my conclusion.
Yeah. And this guy's a perfect example of what you're talking about. This guy, you are setting a wonderful example in the chat. Keep it up, Moshe. I really appreciate you, man. I seriously do, because you're proving Jonathan's point, and we love it. It's exactly, you just start with what you believe and then work backwards, baby. But yeah, keep going. Sorry, I just want to give my friend a little shout out there.
So the next point to look at is this idea of progressive embellishment. So we touched on this last time, and you can see this all over the Gospels. So you can look at Joseph of Arimathea and see how he's progressively embellished throughout the Gospels. You can look at all different narratives, and we start. And someone like William Lane Craig says, it's really interesting, William Lane Craig, because he says, right, Mark is earliest and simplest, therefore he's the most reliable, right? Which he's trying to argue for this kind of idea of, like, therefore these core nuts and bolts are true. But in doing that, he's implicitly accepting that all the later Gospels are adding on adornishments that are historically unreliable. He's saying simple. He's saying early and simple is definitely reliable. Well, then in that case, later and more embellished ain't reliable. So John's right out. Yet John's the one that's presenting this Christology and this idea that high Christology, the idea that Jesus is divine. But I think progressive embellishment is a real problem for if you want to look at the reliability of these Gospels. It just looks like they're adding and adding and adding and changing and changing. And I like what Bart Ehrman says, which is if you're going to harmonize all 4 Gospels together, you're effectively writing a 5th Gospel, which I think is quite nice. It's the idea that they don't all say this one like coherent thing. They've all got 4 different things they're trying to say, and by knitting them all together into this one coherent narrative, you are producing a 5th Gospel.
Yes, the Diatessaron, or technically not really, because he probably cut out whatever and added whatever to make a cohesive narrative. We don't have it, so I wish we did, just to see how creative he was in creating that. But yeah, you're good point. And I think every Christian has a 5th Gospel they actually create, because all of them are harmonizing non-harmonizable material. Now you could force things if you want, but it's still. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's just going to go, and that particularly happens in the Nativity, where Luke and Matthew are so disparate and they're so incoherent. They're just so incongruous with each other. The claims they make that what you do is you go and see your kids in a Nativity play, and whoever devises a Nativity play takes Luke and takes Matthew, and smashes them together and makes some kind of wreck. I always liken it to a car crash. So if you, in 2,000 years' time, you see this vehicle, it's got 8 wheels and 2 steering wheels and smashed up mangled mess. You say, wow, the vehicles back 2,000 years ago had 8 wheels and they had 2 steering wheels. It's incredible. No, they didn't. There were 2 vehicles smashed together that are completely separate vehicles. Right. And that's what I see Matthew and Luke as. And if you're taking that one coherent narrative, what you're doing is you're creating a third narrative.
Absolutely. Well put. I agree with you. I think our audience is tracking.
Yep. Cool. So here's an example of progressive embellishment. Mark, several women who were looking on afar off at Jesus on the cross later beheld where he was laid. There was no detail to their proximity to the tomb. Matthew has the woman there beholding afar off, later sitting against the sepulchre, against the grave, as a vigil and thus concerned. So then we get a little bit of embellishment here. Luke then has and all his acquaintance. So now we've got loads more people. And the woman that followed him from Galilee stood afar off, beholding these things. Later beheld the sepulchre and how the body was laid, returning to their homes to prepare spices and ointments to anoint his body and prepare it for the Sabbath, showing the discipleship and piousness. So, wow, that's just 2 amounts of embellishment upon Mark. And then John details how Jesus' mother and the disciple whom he loved were at the cross, and Jesus had a conversation with them and orders said disciple to take care of his mother, amongst other details, and so on and so forth. So that you get this very clear idea when we'll talk about reading the Gospels horizontally rather than vertically. When you read them across and you see that actually this in Mark is embellished here, in Matthew, here in Luke, even more so, and here in John, really quite different sometimes.
I agree 100%, except Moshe wouldn't agree with you, but it's okay. Please continue.
So then you get people like N.T. Wright who come along and say, this is just the 4 newspaper account. I mean, I presume you would have heard something like this as a Christian. It's like, all these differences are just, they're just like 4 newspaper accounts. They're going to have slight differences, but they're just 4 different viewpoints of the same event. But of course,
that's the typical Christian response, is that it's just different perspectives. They only are concerned about different data. We're going to see that be a problem here in just a bit. Don't worry. Stick around, Moshe. That's why I said that early on. Just continue to watch and you'll see. But yes.
Yeah, so this idea that they're just 4 newspaper accounts. You have Matthew having dead zombies parading around Jerusalem that apparently everyone saw. That's not just like someone else's viewpoint. Like if you saw that, if you had a story of the resurrection that included dead zombies, like the zombie saints parading around Jerusalem that everyone saw, and the veil of the temple getting torn, and that's not in every story, and an earthquake and 3 hours of darkness, and that's not in every story. That's not just 4 newspapers. That's really stretching that analogy.
It's really ridiculous, actually. Now that I look back at myself 8 or 9 years ago, thinking that way and assuming Luke or John would just leave that out of the story.
Yeah.
You know,
it's
only risen saints from the dead. I mean, it's not that, you know, I'm only concerned about this information. Are you kidding me? Like, that would be on the top of the list of what you would want to tell someone if it were true. But obviously, it's only found in Matthew.
I'm just waiting for the cast of The Walking Dead to pop out of the house in Jerusalem with like Negus with a baseball bat and smash some of those zombies. Like, no, they're saints. Don't do that.
Don't do that. Don't do that. And there's no historical, which at least Mike Lacona recognizes. He's like, ooh, let me make this allegory because I don't think I can swallow this pill, because then I wouldn't be an honest historian if I just did that. So yeah.
Oops, I've lost the job.
Yeah,
which we mentioned last time, which is if you dare sometimes to go outside the hyper literal interpretation of the Bible and say, actually, this is clearly allegorical and it's referring to this and it's kind of poetic or whatever, then it's like you can't say that. You've lost your job in this you know, religiously educational institute. And that's, you know, that's not free and open learning, is it? And obviously problematic.
Yeah.
So
in your life away. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have John just being completely different with his regard. You know, the synoptic problem is an issue for the 4 newspaper account just as much, to say that actually John really sees Jesus as God. He establishes it from the beginning. We have this idea that Jesus is so different. And, you know, I am the way, the truth, and the light, and all this kind of stuff that you would suddenly, the synoptics are like, oh, that's just not important to have in. Oh, you know, the fact that really explicitly Jesus is actually God. Yeah, we'll leave that. It's not so important. You're like, what? That's insane.
No, you're 100% right.
So and what we have here, and I mentioned this, I think in the previous talk a little bit with regard to the Noah's Ark. I brought that in and said, when you hear it, and it's over and over in songs and stories and cartoons, and as a child, every year, all the time, every Sunday, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, then you go to Bible study, and these things become normalized, right? And normalization means that you end up being, we actually know this from research, that when you normalize things, they become more credible. Which is how fake news, which spreads 6 times faster than actual factual news, and as a result of seeing it more often, you then challenge it less. So just imagine being a Christian nowadays, hearing these stories about the resurrection over and over and over and over and over, 4 newspaper account over and over and over. This, it's fine. It's fine. I totally, this is all normal. I don't question the fact that you've got a dying, rising God and somehow pays for sins, blah, blah, blah. It's just all true. There you go. And it's what I do, and it's what I believe, and it's how I act. And every Sunday, this is just, you know, this is concreted even further into my psyche.
I agree with you. You also get into, in the same section where you talk about New Testament scholars and how most of them are Christians. And you used an analogy. I know I underlined so much stuff in this section for this episode. We're screwed if I had to read it all. You go into Bloomberg, Craig, on the resurrection, faith or fact. I underlined a bunch on that on page 46. So for those of you who have the book, you might want to track along, you know, and really see.
I was going to talk about that part in the bit where we talk about the empty tomb, because that's predominantly about the empty tomb and this idea. But now that I've started talking about it, I suppose I better finish. So the idea that 75, you used to hear this quite a lot, because I think all of us used to listen to William Lane Craig a lot, and now I suppose less so. I don't know. Maybe I'm speaking on behalf of myself, but you hear this claim a lot, which is 75% of New Testament scholars believe in the empty tomb. You're like, yeah, okay. 99.9% of Islamic scholars believe in the truth of the revelation of Muhammad. Don't make that true.
Yeah,
you know, this is selection bias of the highest order. And in fact, when you look at the breakdown of the details, 75% is very low. I would expect more New Testament scholars, given the prevalence of Christian belief within that discipline. I'd expect far more New Testament scholars to believe in the empty tomb thesis. So 75% is actually pretty low, but even so, it has absolutely nothing to do with the truth value of the claim.
True. And so are we dealing with an empty tomb, or are we waiting on that? Because
that comes in another we won't deal with the empty tomb today, but we'll
okay.
lead up,
I was just going to mention in your book, though, what you do say is Habermas used to have 12 points of like absolute facts, right? This is Gary Habermas, Dr. Habermas, who's a serious Christian scholar. And I mean, I'm not trying to downplay that he's not a serious scholar. The point is, he's coming with these lenses on, and he's just affirming his already preconceived notions. And he's even retracted this because only 75% of scholars accept that there was an empty tomb. So now when he talks about these 6 facts that are supposedly historical, he goes, and he died, and then and he rose again. And you're like, well, what happened to the empty tomb? Like, that was part of your thing. And I know that Bart Ehrman even backed off of there being a historical empty tomb and went, this is actually myth. I don't buy.
So he, absolutely. One thing, even William Lane Craig, I think in debate used to mention Joseph Arimathea quite a bit, and he doesn't seem to mention him anymore in debate when dealing explicitly with the resurrection, at least not that I've seen in recent debates, which is to say that actually some of the counter arguments are finding purchase from the skeptical movement to make some of these popular apologists tinker with their arguments. Okay, that's not so strong. I'm going to rely on these ones instead. Absolutely.
Real quick, let me let something shine. I did say Christian, not because I'm saying he's not a Christian. I'm saying pay attention to the fact that he's a scholar who's a Christian, because you see it in his work. It's not like these guys are coming at this historically, using all the historical method and accurately coming at this data, trying to be skeptical and critical and say, it's plausible that this isn't true. They're coming at this thing with they're already in the faith. I think that that's what's happened with Habermas. So I totally just want to clarify that, yes, Christian scholar.
And remember, we talked about this last time. When you challenge Christians in particular on certain claims, and this might be the resurrection, you're also challenging them on their access to eternal life in heaven. So that can also work individually from a Christian scholar saying, right, I'm going to really bottom out my thoughts on I'm going to research the Jesus out of the empty tomb. But subconsciously in the back of their mind is like, if I find it to be false, I might be invalidating my access to eternal life in paradise.
I think Mike Licona dealt with some trauma in his faith. Mike Licona actually said at one point he was doubting and almost lost the faith. And then what happened? Boom, sucked himself back into it. So yeah. And one more thing I want to say for those who might be Christians watching me right now and think this is a mocker, a scoffer. You're going at it not wanting it to be true. Therefore, well, I want to say to you, my friend, let's approach the Greek mythology the same way, let's put the same blinders that you put on for Christianity, and let's go read the Greek myths of the different deities performing the acts. And I'm going to go out of my way to prove them true. And that's Quran. Not how you treat that material, but all of a sudden special pleading happens when we get to the Bible.
Yeah. So Christians will happily scoff at the Quran. And why aren't those miracle claims true? Well, and they'll apply like probability analyses of these miracle claims, say, well, they're incredibly improbable and that evidence is really poor. But when it comes to my miracle claims and my evidence is awesome. And it's exactly complete double standards. So what we'll do now is start getting onto some of those the nuts and bolts of the claims. Interestingly, so this book by Michael Alter, right, looks at the resurrection. This is a doorstop of a book. I mean, it's incredible. It's 1,000 pages, and he goes to town on every single verse of the Passion narratives. It's incredible. And I try to summarize, large parts of what he said into a much smaller book that's digestible, and hopefully it sort of worked for you, Derek.
Dude, your book is good. I got to say, for anyone who wants to check this out, it's not too much to chew on. It's really taken a lot of this stuff and then put it down into a paragraph instead of like chapters on. You don't go into like critically examining these particular details. These other scholars have. You bring up the points, though, that are relevant to just get to the point. And that's something I think is fascinating about what you do in your book. It's not a scholarly like tome where you have to go down and look at the sources and, all right, where's the references and all this kind of stuff. Like, you're not overly doing it. You know, it's something that is a popular.
Yeah. So is it Gary Habermas himself that's just finishing writing his Resurrection, but it's 5,000 pages. So he's got to somehow get that, you know, and the problem is that was literally my choice. It's like, well, if I really want to go to town on every single point and present the counter argument and the counter argument and you know, this book will be 1,000 pages and no one want to read it. So how do I somehow make it comprehensive enough and yet digestible enough to do the job? And, you know, it's a difficult path to navigate.
Wow. Well,
a lot of words.
Yeah.
So I think that the first point to mention about the events leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus is the Last Supper. Okay.
So my book. Yeah, there's stuff I'm going to have to jab in and read from your book, bro. I got to do it.
So this is one of these super important points, and the reason why it's super important is because John has the Last Supper and the crucifixion happening on a different day to the Synoptic Gospels, and the reason he does that is very, very important, because John, actually rather like Paul, so Paul and John have a similar theology here, which is that Jesus is the actual, in a hyperliteral sense as well as a metaphorical sense, the Paschal Lamb, the Passover Lamb. So Jesus is crucified, you know, at a later on a later day to coincide with the Passover festival, and the meal that happens beforehand, the Last Supper, is not the Passover meal for John, but for the Synoptics it is. Which is why they have things happening on different days, which is impossible to harmonize. I don't know how you do it, but Christians, you know, they always find a way, but you just can't really do it. Now,
I mean, you're telling me there's a chance? I'm just kidding.
Yeah. If it's a 0.000%, this is something called possibilita ergo probabilita. If it's possible, it is possible, therefore it's probable. And this is a really common technique that you see employed by Christian apologists. I debated the nativity with Lydia McGrew on Unbelievable, and this is basically her entire debate was, well, here's what could have happened, so therefore that's what did happen. So whoa, that's a really big jump of probabilities there, going for this is got a really low probability chance of happening, and it's what happened. And also this bit is really low probability is what happened in this bit, and so your case is entirely built up of exceptionally low probability events happening one after the other. It's like it's not sound.
I do like what you said there about the because this ties into the Lord's Supper that Paul has. Paul's, if you will, communion, Paul's Eucharist is a strange one that you only see in John. And the way that it's phrased here is evident that John and Paul are on the same page in this idea. Dennis MacDonald points this out when he wrote his book, The Dionysian Gospel, where he sees Euripides the Bacchae Dionysus, the deity, being Jesus is better, greater. So the author John is making him a better deity than this pagan one, right? And here you have Dionysus is shredded by the teeth of the Titans. Jesus is being eaten by ingesting the God. You are also ingesting eternal life. And this idea of eat my flesh, drink my blood in John 6 is not in Matthew, Luke, or Mark in this respect. It's not phrased that way. You see what I mean?
You've got all sorts of stuff going on. So whenever, you know, in the nativity accounts, you've got Jesus is Caesar Augustus, but better. Jesus is Moses, but better. You know, it's all about, like, if I'm trying to convince you that Jesus is either the Messiah or God, I'm going to take who you think is the coolest person on earth, and I'm going to one up that person or that deity or that entity. So whoever you think is your number one entity, Jesus is better. And this is how
they did this with Yahweh. If you go to the idea of the Mesopotamian myths being borrowed, because the early one, the gods were afraid, they couldn't. So finally you have Tiamat get destroyed by Marduk, and Marduk just had to show up. All God in the Bible had to do was speak, and existence came, and the chaos was destroyed, or at least tamed. But you get later on in the flood narrative, and instead of blaming the gods for being tired of the humans being too loud, God says, no, the humans are to blame. They're responsible. And their wickedness is what caused it. It had nothing to do with the God. So they're making God look better
really
already.
Important. Yeah, big time. Hugely important. Like we talked about before, it's the differences that tell you that are delivering the message. So we have Paul. It talks about bread. The bread at the Last Supper is not. The term used isn't unleavened bread. So it looks like Paul is not actually talking about a Passover meal, which was a very particular meal, obviously in the Jewish ritual calendar. Everything Orthodox Jewish is just covered in rules and regulations, right? And so what you have here is, I think John and Paul are saying you can get rid of the Passover meal because Jesus is literally the Paschal Lamb. And we know this as well because John's the only gospel that very clearly says Jesus' legs were not broken on the cross. So the way to hasten the death of someone on the cross, it's called cruciflagrarum or something. The way of hastening death is to break their legs.
Right.
John says it didn't happen. Instead, he says explicitly they didn't break his legs. I think he might even say in order to fulfill the scriptures. So it's all very contrived. And then he has them piercing his side. Now, the reason he doesn't have them breaking the legs is because the Paschal Lamb, as according to Exodus and other mentions in the Hebrew Bible, the Paschal Lamb is not allowed to have its legs broken, right? So if Jesus is literally the Paschal Lamb, and metaphorically, he can't have his legs broken. So John says, and he doesn't have his legs broken. So John is clearly presenting a theology. It's theology, not history. Theology, not history. John is presenting Jesus in a particular way that the synoptics did not. And that's, again, it's not the 4 newspaper account. This is just 2 wildly different theologies going on here.
Right.
And I think, this then explains the discrepancy in the day of the crucifixion and also the day of the Passover meal.
You're 100% right. I don't know if I've got one of your quotes here that I probably marked. John's Gospel on page 100 for those of you who've got the book. And by the way, we've still got like 3 or 4 more episodes on this particular book. I'm doing this with your nativity, man. We have to do this on your book on the nativity too, because
that's a lot of fun you can have with the nativity, because there's just no way of harmonizing those bad boys.
I definitely look forward to it. Page 100 of the book, if you end up getting it, at the bottom paragraph, you say John's Gospel, starting as it does with John the Baptist, is the only one that sees Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. His Gospel is the only one that sees Jesus as dying on the same day as a Passover lamb, the day of preparation. Indeed, he dies at the exact same hour, the same place, Jerusalem, and at the hands of the same people, the Jewish leaders, as Passover lambs. The whole narrative has immense theological significance.
Yeah, and this then brings me on to something that I'm not going to talk about in this episode, but this is Yom Kippur, which is where Jesus, the whole Passion narrative is Yom Kippur, which is their ritual atonement ceremony for the Jews. And we'll explain that in later gospel. But I want to share with you something now, which is a quote from someone who is summing up John Dominic Crossan's work. And I think this is so important to understanding how the gospels were put together. It is my favorite quote.
What page?
It's not on the page.
Okay.
Oh, it is in there somewhere, actually, but I'm going to share it on my screen. So if I can do this,
sure.
I hopefully do it correctly. There we go.
We did not prep the share screen before this show.
Yeah.
All right, you're sharing the screen. Go ahead and make it large if you can.
Yeah, is that the one? I've now got to go through it all.
Theology, not history.
So have you got one screen up, or have you flicking through it with me?
I'm not flicking through it. You're the one who has control.
In that case, it hasn't come up as full screen. So we'll just go with this. So theology, not history. So this is a quote from Hans Moskika. So Crossan argues that the Passion tradition evolved through 3 primary stages. P1, the historical Passion. In other words, someone was crucified or someone was executed. P2, the prophetic Passion, which is, let's go back and understand this in terms of prophecies in the Old Testament. And P3, the narrative passion. Now we're going to write it. So let's explain this. During P1, Jesus was crucified, but his earliest followers knew none of the details of his execution. During P2, Jesus' disciples interpreted the meaning of his death in light of the Old Testament, but they did so without reference to the particular details of the Passion events. In other words, it's like, Jesus has died. How do we understand this? Let's go back and look at the Old Testament. Oh, look at all this stuff. It might actually have nothing to do with the actual events that took place.
Right.
But now we're going to go to P3, which is during P3, Jesus' followers organized this complex array of scriptural proof texts into a coherent and sequential narrative, refining and augmenting the story with a verisimile historical detail. So this to me is basically sums up the New Testament in a sense, or certainly the Gospels, which is Jesus died. Followers didn't really understand how the Messiah could be executed. They go to the Old Testament, they find a load of stuff that they can throw at the historical Jesus, and they throw this theology at an Old Testament scripture at the actual historical Jesus. And then they write this down into a narrative that basically invented this mythology. And I think that really beautifully sums up what I think was happening. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm using another example, so to speak, because you have to consider what kind of mindset these people probably had. Cognitive dissonance sets in for people who are believers in a particular tradition. Or they're looking for signs or whatever. And people saw like the rebuilding, for example, or the reestablishment of the state of Israel and said, oh my goodness, where in the Bible do we see this? Oh, Jeremiah, oh, this, Isaiah, they run to the Bible and they find something, they find significance somehow. And when you already believe this guy's the Messiah, what if there is a historical Jesus, and I want to grant that here in this episode, because you and me lean that way anyway. If there is this guy, how do you explain what happens when he dies? Well, they believe he is. So let's see, the scriptures say, and they're like reading this matrix for their life on how they're supposed to live,
But not only that, Paul and John particularly and Matthew actually are very explicit in saying this happened because of the scriptures. Right. So they say, I mean, the Christian would say, well, that's exactly how the world was organized, which then gets onto very difficult understandings of theological determinism, which is, if this was prophesied 600 years ago, then you can't change anything about the world, the way the world will turn out, because this has to map exactly onto this 600 years later. There's a huge amount of problems with that, but they are very happy to say this happened because of the scriptures. I found this, I was revealed to this because of the scriptures. So this is all about, reinterpreting the scriptures in a new way and chucking everything at Jesus.
You mentioned that Paul, when he talks about, I got this from no one, but from the Lord and from the scriptures or something.
Exactly. Yeah. So the next part to come onto this after the Last Supper is a hugely problematic event in the story. And it's a capture and trial. And it's so hugely problematic because it literally, historically, couldn't have happened. Certainly couldn't have happened how it was described in
Moshe. Are you hearing this? Thank you. Please, Jonathan, sorry.
You just can't have it. It just didn't happen. And in fact, for this to have happened in the Passover week is just impossible. They wouldn't have put on trial and crucified someone in the Passover week. It just wouldn't have happened. But not only that, they break about 1,000 laws in so doing. Obviously, that's it.
We're going to have to read some stuff here.
So I'm gonna read a little bit from Michael Alter, that big book. So
page 102 for everybody.
Page 102. So initially, the priests had just completed their busiest day in the year, the 14th day of Nisan, presiding over and organizing the slaughter of thousands of lambs in the temple, to say nothing of the obligation to attend their own Paschal meal. That very evening, the evening of the Passover meal, they were to leave their families in the dead of night to assist in the arrest of Jesus. Now, remember, you can't actually leave. You can't go into the night on Passover night. You can't leave the house, right? So second, the Synoptic Gospels report that the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, held 2 trials immediately after the arrest of Jesus. It's not plausible that the Sanhedrin would have convened twice, once in the night and once in the morning on the 15th of Nisan. Now that the evening had started and the Passover Seder, that's the meal, had commenced, the chief priests and the elders were supposedly going to leave their families in the dead of night to participate in not 1 but 2 trials. Further, those present at the trial were not just the chief priests and elders, the scribes and members of the temple guard were also present. Mark 14:55 went so far as to state that this trial occurred in the presence of, quote, all the council, the entire Sanhedrin is. So, and the chief priests, quote, and the chief priests and all the council sought for witness against Jesus to put him to death and found none, close quote. It is totally implausible to believe that between 60 and up to 100 people would have left their Passover meal, leaving their families and guests in order to participate in two separate trials.
Right.
That wouldn't have happened, right? But it gets worse. The whole trial of Jesus was itself illegal. In addition to these claims above, we can argue that there are further impossibilities. 1, trials could not take place in the evening. 2, nor on the Sabbath or other Jewish feast days. 3, nor could they be brought in a private home. 4, one could not convict a man without witnesses. 5, nor without any charge as per Luke. 6, one could not execute a man without a death sentence, since the Sanhedrin did not condemn him to death. And 7, death sentences could not be pronounced until at least a day after the interrogation, to name but a few of the illegal trial issues. It's just, and funnily enough, that's just the start. So there's a Jewish a legal expert called Chaim Cohn, who has written about this, and he said the trial is incompatible with multiple well-established provisions of ancient Jewish law. In fact, I love this. In fact, the violations of Jewish law in Jesus' trial dogpile on each other so fast it's hard to keep up. All of them are virtually inconceivable and, of course, highly improper. Neglecting Passover, meeting by night, holding trial in private home, conducting a trial in secret, the high priest acting as interrogating himself and even striking the defendant with his hand, the failure of the witnesses to agree, mocking them and beating the prisoner, and many more, any of which would have resulted in a mistrial. Even worse, they appear to have deliberately misrepresented certain aspects of the trial to paint the Jewish religious leaders as stereotypical villains. And then he goes on to note other implausibilities, right? But that's really important as well, because it's what these gospel authors trying to communicate. So, and this is famous for John, is he's trying to pin it on the Jews and not the Romans, right? So the Romans aren't the people who, because remember, you are presenting to your audience a new religion that you want them to sign up to, right? So you are saying, here is this new religion, and you are presently, arguably, they're either Jews living in diaspora like communities or in the Jerusalem area or in Israel. So you are convincing them to drop Judaism and take up this thing, or you're presenting it to Gentiles and saying, you know, those Jews, they're horrible, nasty people, they're the bad guys, you want to become a Christian. And this also goes to the heart of the matter with why Jesus is being presented as a Paschal lamb, but also why they're getting rid of other rules. This is about replacing the rules and regulations of Judaism. So imagine, Derek, right? You are a potential convert. I'm a Christian. I come to you and say, Derek, I've got this awesome new religion. It's Christianity, and it's about this dying and rising divine figure called Jesus. And this is how it works, blah, 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 blah. And I explain it all to you. And you go, that's amazing. This is brilliant. This is brilliant, Jonathan Pierce. I love this religion. Sign me up. What do I have to do? And then I go to you. Well, funny you should mention that. I would like you to cut off the end of your penis. That's the first thing I want you to do. And you're going to go, what? What? So it's really important to understand the pragmatic implications of these Jewish regulations, which is to say, if I'm trying to convert shed loads of other people to this religion, this is what Paul was going through in these arguments he was having with the early church, which is to say that, are you serious? We've got to convince people to cut the end of their penises off? Like, this is not a big sell. Like, Derek, we had Derek and he's done a runner.
You know, if I may, this is a wonderful point you make. In that same paragraph, going down to the second paragraph, he says, the same attorney general, if I'm not mistaken, he says, the Gospels are so completely wrong about first century Jewish religious politics. The Pharisees and the high priest were never in cahoots with one another. Nothing could be further from the truth. They were bitter political enemies. In reality, most everyone in Judea hated the high priest, who was both a Sadducee, the Pharisees' political opponents, and a puppet appointee working for the hated Romans. The Pharisees regarded the temple priesthood as mere ceremonial functionaries, doing the nation's spiritual grunt work, keeping the sacrifices going and maintaining the temple. Even the best of times, the Pharisees seemed to regard most high priests as little more than trained monkeys, saying a learned bastard takes precedence over an ignorant priest. Now, this is amazing. Yeah, ignorant high priest. This is wonderful information, because when we run to Josephus, what are we stuck with? Accepting that the biblical, highly theological, extremely narrative story-like picture is actually accurately historically true. As example, Pontius Pilate. What a wonderful guy he is. I mean, he's a saint, you know. Pilate's a saint. God bless that man, you know. When we read in Josephus and what he was doing and how he really was, what are you going to believe? Are you really going to keep accepting this narrative? Or what about Herod and killing all the little children? Yeah. You know, like, where do we draw this line? What's more likely? Mimesis borrowing from the narrative of the Old Testament, making a fiction? Or...
So with Pontius Pilate, of course, you then start, would he be the sort of person to let off a random Jew from being crucified as some religious festival? We've got no evidence of this ever happening. So what is going on here? And again, the key is asking, why is this being what is being communicated here? What is the author trying to say? And we'll come on to, I don't want to spoil this, but you let one of the criminals go, because that's what you do at Yom Kippur. You let a goat go and you kill the other goat. And the other goats, you have a sacrificial goat, Jesus, and you have one that you let go. Yeah. And then you mock the sacrificial goat, and you put a scarlet thing around it and a crown of a band of thorns. It's like, oh, this looks like the scarlet robe and a crown of thorns. And then you kill it, and and it atones for the sins. Oh, right. So the whole resurrection narrative is just Yom Kippur. Right. Okay. I get it. I get it. So
it's replacing it, though. That's the point.
That's the key. So it's saying, like, you as a Jewish audience, or if you're not Jewish, you still make it make sense. But for the Jews, right, it's like, what you know and what you love, we've just got a better version of this. And brackets, you don't have to cut the end of your penis off. So hey, bonus.
I think that whole cutting the end of the penis thing off, I can't get over the idea that is a pro-Gentile notion. You can't picture why that wouldn't be a practical, like, implementation into this version of Christianity like that. Well, let's see. Do we really want to get everybody on board, or do we want to keep this thing as limited and as small as possible for as long as possible? So that's why I think there are different sects.
Yeah, it's also on the trial thing. I mean, Richard Carrier has it. I don't know if you want to read out a bit of the Richard Carrier quote, but he also says, so none of this really works, but the more devastating point is that none of these dates is even possibly true. Under Jewish and governed by a local treaty Roman law at the time, executions could not be performed on holy days. Trials for capital crimes by the Sanhedrin, as in all the Gospels depict, had to be conducted over the course of 2 days, and could not be conducted on or even interrupted by a Sabbath or holy day, nor ever conducted at night. The gospel trial narratives violate every single one of these rules. Their authors thus did not even know or didn't care how Jewish law in early Roman Judea worked, and can't have been recording anything that actually happened. In historical reality, had Jesus been arrested during or immediately before Passover, he would have been held over in jail until Sunday morning, and could only have been convicted on a Monday evening at the earliest. Days after the Passover could have occurred, so on and so on and so on and so forth. It's just so that the capture and the trial part of the story can't work, right?
No.
None of the details. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. You mentioned in the page before that, we're on page 104 of his book here. You say Matthew 26:57 says that on the night Jesus was arrested, the priest and scribes were gathered together prior to Jesus being brought to the high priest. In direct contrast, Mark 14:53 says they were gathered on the night of Jesus' arrest after Jesus was brought to the high priest. So I guess he was brought to the high priest at 2 different times, if you want to harmonize everything. And then you go on to say Luke 22:66 says they assembled the day after Jesus was arrested, while John mentions only the high priest and no one else plays a role. Such how do you pronounce that word? Multitudinous discrepancies. I get the point. A lot of discrepancies is your point. And we're only just getting started. Luke states in 23:7-11 that Pilate sent Jesus to Herod Antipas, tetrarch and ruler of Galilee and Perea, who questioned Jesus for some time before returning him. However, the other Gospels do not mention this event at all. Moreover, jurisdiction for a crime is determined by where it took place, not where the criminal came from, presenting even more problems with this narrative. This whole scene makes no legal sense.
No, and it gets even worse, right? So you're not allowed to carry weapons on. So it has on a feast day. So you have when Jesus was arrested, Peter is carrying weapons. The people arresting him are carrying weapons. And also you have when the claim of Simon of Cyrene helps Jesus take the cross. He comes off from working on the fields. And that's what they get him in to help Jesus carry the cross. Of course, you can't be working on fields on a feast day. And so these are being written by people who have been brought up, I think, in Christian sects, such that they aren't so knowledgeable about Jewish law. I mean, you get Mark being corrected several times by Matthew. So Matthew is a bit more knowledgeable of Jewish ritual, and he actually corrects Mark throughout the Gospel of Mark, or throughout the Gospel of Matthew. But ostensibly, we have stuff that just basically couldn't have happened, and any like really proper sort of Jewish, someone who knew a lot about Jewish law would have known this. But for the Christians, it doesn't really matter at that point, because they've been brought up within this Christian sect and then are writing a history of Jesus that makes sense to them. And it makes sense to the audience now, because you know, most Christians now, they're not going to know that actually all of that is illegal under Jewish law.
No. And most don't know that, actually.
No.
Yeah, there's very few scholars probably that are acquainted with this particular detail and seeing this discrepancy. I'm actually kind of, I wonder what Christian scholars do in their head to try and make sense of this. They probably go, at this time, I'm trying to think super theological as a Christian again, right? And I say, they probably thought at this time, the Jews were so wicked. And I bet early church fathers, if any of them were acquainted with this or had heard rejections from Jews about this, if anyone were knowledgeable about it, let's say Justin Martyr or someone, they would probably go, well, God was taking the kingdom away from Israel and making a new Israel, the church, or something like that, replacement theology, because there's so much jab at the Jews. You can't help but listen to people like Rabbi Tovia Singer when they criticize the New Testament, saying it's anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Because look at how it paints the Jewish people over and over and over,
Yeah, I mean, I think historically speaking, the Gospel of John has been sort of ammunition for anti-Semitic sort of approaches. So this is something of a problem. So then we go on to the day of crucifixion, and already we've seen that there's discrepancy in what day Jesus is crucified on, as according to, like I always want to say in my Bart Ehrman voice, it depends which gospel you read. There are, again, contradictions here in the time of day. He not only the day, but the time of day. So, Mark has him in the third hour, so that's 9 a.m., the third hour after the 6 a.m. sunrise. Matthew has him crucified sometime after the 6th hour, which is noon. And then John agrees with Matthew. So, it's you have these problems that Christians always sort of try and harmonize by saying, well, they're using the Roman civil calendar in this situation, or they're using that, and it's like, no,
the Mayan calendar in this.
Yeah. But, so the great Catholic exegete, there's just a one-line quote. I won't read you his whole quote, but he's talking about how the problems with harmonizing these times of crucifixion. And he says, most likely they found a time indication like the 6th hour mentioned by all in the tradition and attached it to different moments of the Passion. And this is the bit I highlight, according to their respective dramatic and theological interest. So this is Raymond Brown saying they all have theological and dramatic interests. They've got an agenda, theological agenda, and a dramatic. It's persuasive, isn't it? We want to be as dramatic as possible. This has to have purchase with our audience. So I'm going to write it. My narrative is going to have it in this way that is dramatically and theologically intensely important to me and my audience.
And you go on to say right after that in page 108 for those. I'm going to keep reminding you guys, if you have the book, you can keep track with me, whether it's ebook or paper. You say this is one of those diamond quotes that open up a whole can of worms for Christian apologists, and from within their own ranks. This is an explicit admission that the gospel authors were manipulating data to fit their own theological and dramatic agendas. Facts and truth play second fiddle to politics and theology. And then you go on to quote Jack Finnegan, and he goes on to say, but anyway, I didn't know if you want me to quote that. I didn't really underline that one, but I think the one above was really, really good.
So the question that then I come up with, which what if I was a Christian, right? So, and it's this idea that is inerrancy important? Like, so if it's, to me as a secular, I just go, here's a bunch of documents that are just all slightly inaccurate, right? I would say it gets worse than that, and they are terminally problematic. But at the very least, the Christian should just be. Why can't the Christian just go? Yeah, there are some contradictions. Oh well, one of them's probably right, but the general idea is that Jesus is crucified. Why is this? Why is there this desire to make sure that every single claim in the Bible has to be supported by every other claim and coherent with every other claim? And I think that's where the Christian, as soon as you start going down that route, it becomes untenable, because you end up putting these band-aids everywhere, as I say, and it's just a mess, complete mess. I mean, it's a mess no matter what, but at least admit it's a bit of a mess. I
agree. I used to wear band-aids all the time.
but every if you ask 4 people to write an account of an event, every person will write a different account of events, and people are going to get stuff wrong. But it's this idea that these gospels are inspired. They're the inspired word of God, and because they're the inspired word of God, somehow these gospel writers had God working through them when they were writing it, and so therefore they are just you can't contest any of the things they're claiming. It's just like, well, that's not how any other book in the world works, and you would never allow that to be claimed of any other book of any other religion. So you are again special pleading.
Yeah, they definitely wouldn't grant that, even though that's exactly what Islam will try to grant is, Gabriel or God through Gabriel to Muhammad, so yeah, about the Quran. But yeah, I guess carrying the cross is our next one.
Yeah, so carrying the cross is an interesting one. John doesn't have, he has Jesus explicitly carrying the cross. So again, John is right out. And the other gospels, there's this idea that someone else helps carry the cross, Simon of Cyrene, and I've already said this is a problem, because if he is working on the fields and they get him out, then he couldn't have been working on the field. So, but you get this weird scenario where you then get these narratives, extra kind of biblical narratives that get built up about why someone else is involved in helping to carry the cross. And then you get these accounts that you find on Apologies website with saying this could have happened and maybe this and that. And then people are just making shit up to be sorry, excuse my French, but they're just like, he had some, like, what's the term? Hypovolemic shock or something. Hypovolemic.
What is that? Go ahead and let our audience know what
bulimic shock. So this is like one apologist website saying the heart would race to pump blood that was not there. The victim would collapse and faint due to low blood pressure. The kidneys would shut down to preserve body fluids. The person would experience extreme thirst, and the body desired to replenish lost fluids. This is why he was offered drinks or whatever. And you're thinking, okay, this is just, you're just making stuff up now. Like, yeah, that could have happened. That could be an explanation. But you fill your account with so many modal verbs that this could have happened. This might have happened. But what's then interesting is like the Catholic Church writes this into stops of the where I talk about how I'm no massive Catholic knowledge, but you get the Stations of the Cross.
Yeah, you say it in right here. It has even been baked into a Catholic devotion, the Stations of the Cross, the 3 stops devoted to his falls, quotation marks, by the way. Because of course, this is not evidenced anywhere in the Gospels and is a mere apologetic assertion showing how easy it is for facts or beliefs about an event to appear over time and get written into ritual.
Yeah, so then exactly that. That says it all, which is you start having, you just start creating. I mean, this is how myths happen. This is how people make stuff up, and then suddenly it's written into ritual, and everyone thinks, well, Jesus fell 3 times or whatever. And it's like, oh, wait, where are the details of this? I mean, John doesn't have it at all. And then you know, so I think it's all whatever. And then so we move on to the thieves on the cross. And the thieves on the cross are interesting because, again, you get a difference between all the Gospels as to who was there, where they were positioned in the crosses, on the crosses, who said what to whom. And it's just far more contradictions in place. But there's an interesting one that comes from Luke 23:43, which says that truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise, right? And the reason that that's interesting is because it says, I am getting resurrected today. There's no 3 days later here. This is Jesus saying, you're going to be with me in paradise. And of course, that contradicts all the other claims about, 3 days later and then ascension into. So I don't know. It's just more problems. Again, problems dogpiling on problems.
Different stories. It's really simple to say they're just writing their own versions. But of course, they all have to be perfectly in line with one another because this is the witnesses of Jesus and he's God in flesh. And so there's a problem there. You see what I'm saying? You don't need to have that kind of an error. Look, I've got Christian buddies who do not. They accept this idea that there are problems, that these are narratives, that even they're theological and sometimes not historical. They're still Christians. If you want to be a Christian, cool. You are dying on a hill that looks ridiculous when it starts to get analyzed, just so you know that. If you want to stay on that hill, stay on it. That's fine. You can continue to stay on any hill you want. But
Of course, when you're also recording what people were saying to each other, again, we get back to this problem about, I said to you last time, the alarm bell should be ringing. As soon as you say, this person said this to this person replied that. But who is standing at Jesus's cross close enough to be able to hear? The guards should be there. You're not, they wouldn't have allowed to be right up close. I wouldn't have thought. And then who's like etching down what was said from one person to the other? You have Luke having this conversation between Jesus and one of the other criminals, and it's just not attested to in any of the other ones, gospels. And who's the source for this? How do you know this is true? Because none of the other gospels say it, and it seems to be there's contradictions in whether one of the criminals rebukes Jesus or not, and it depends which gospel you read.
Right.
You're like, well,
yeah, you're right.
And it's just every verse you come across, you're like, oh, I'm not happy about the accuracy here because the stories don't jive with each other. So and then I'll share this with you just because it's there it is. This is just, you can find these all over the internet, right? So this is nothing special, but this is a sort of thing that people put together to show contradictions. Okay, how many women went to the tomb? When did they go to the tomb? What did the woman see? What was said? Did Jesus appear to the woman? Which disciples went to the tomb? Did the disciples believe the reports of the woman? How many disciples did Jesus appear to first? Where were the disciples told to go, and where did Jesus send into heaven? And everyone gives a different answer.
Yeah, and then they try to find a way to harmonize them all. Oh, they're just different perspectives. Yeah, go to Galilee. You'll find me there. Oh, nope, stay in Jerusalem. Like the accounts you can't be in two of this. Lest the disciples are also omnipresent, I don't see how you can be in both Galilee and Jerusalem at the same time. There's a lot of, this is the stuff I'm saying about inerrantist, and this is what we're really taking down. Also should cast doubt on like how reliable, how confident should you be in this narrative to begin with?
Yeah, and you get some of these contrivances like, well, this person only said this person turned up. You're Mary Magdalene, and this person said 3 people turned up, or more people, and then you get this idea that but 3 people includes one person. It's like, well, that kind of apologetics is ridiculous because it says that I could say, do you know what? Whenever I mention the number 1 million, I actually mean any number under 1 million. So it's like, how many people turned up to the party? 1 million. Well, okay, this person had 3. Yeah, but 1 million includes 3. So, or like, we're both right. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
you get these kind of apologetic tactics that are just like, no, that's not how we use language.
What do you do with this? What do you do when someone comes along and says, Calvary, the hill you die on in your head, it's the throne of the pineal gland. Jesus was 33 years of age. There are 33 degrees up to the spinal pineal gland, which releases, I mean, this is the thing. I've heard all of this stuff, right? I'm MythVision. MythVision's had some pretty French stuff also find its way on the channel. So it's drawn in a lot of different ideas. Jim Carrey came on and was like talking about this stuff on one of his episodes because he's gotten into this whole esoteric stuff, as if all of these books are complete esoteric. And therefore, let's defend them as esoteric text and let's divorce them from having any literal explanation. So technically, Jesus dying and rising again, he didn't really die. Jesus is you and me. And I think it's interesting, but I interviewed a scholar once that talked about astrotheology, and he said, don't you realize it? You are Christ. You're the one dying between two thieves. And this is what he said. The thief on the left and the thief on the right. One is your past, one is your future. Like, do you see how, like, who is telling you that that is how these things must be interpreted? And how do you know? Like, where is this guy saying, oh, by the way, nothing you're reading on face value means what it says. So when you look up the terms death and all these, they don't mean that. They mean something completely different.
And who's the arbiter? How do you know that you're right? And you get all these questions about, well, your esoteric version is utterly different from this esoteric version. So what's your metric of comparing the accuracy? You know, how do you verify this? Because at the moment you're just making stuff up. Like I can make up an esoteric version of
you and me can come up with an awesome one.
And I was just going to say, like a really kind of fun out there one, but it has about as much epistemic warrant and justification as yours. And so and this is the whole idea, is when you divorce the theology of what you're trying to say from the underlying history, and you're saying, well, this history didn't happen, this just becomes an assertion out of pure nothing, and therefore you can say whatever you like. And it gets Derek Bennett. You interviewed Derek Bennett the other day. He talked about parallelomania against parallelophobia. So, but you got two ends of the spectrum, which is you can find as many parallels as you want, 33, blah, 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 pineal gland, blah, whatever. You can find those parallels. Parallels are everywhere. It's like those Rorschach tests or whatever. You know, you find a pattern. You can find whatever you like in whatever you like. There's almost infinite like parallels you can find. But on the other hand, some parallels are interesting and important, and people are, the gospel authors or biblical authors are drawing on earlier sources and other sources from outside of the geographical and cultural area. And so it's not to dismiss all parallels, but it's not to take on every parallel as well. Yeah.
Or to divorce it completely from having any actual, like, are they, even if they're writing history, are they, or fiction, I mean, a historical fiction here, are we now going to pretend that everything is all of a sudden astrotheology? Like the Devil's Pulpit, there was a book written by, you know who I'm talking about. Guy said everything was astrotheology. So when it talks about, like, here's an example. John the Baptist says, I must decrease and he must increase. Well, this idea was also picked up by Acharya S. And Acharya S, which was a famous mythicist, would say,
I remember.
Well, John the Baptist is the sun. He's like the Elijah figure. He's a sun figure who is now decreasing. The sun is going down. We're entering into a winter solstice, I guess. And Jesus is kind of this, I don't know how they described it. It's some like figurative thing. At the end of the day, it shouldn't have any power. I don't see how it would even have any power at anymore, because that's not the way people have ever really understood it throughout all of Orthodoxy or throughout history. And we don't have any early literature pointing out this is how they interpreted these things. So
and yet, of course, that's not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. There are interesting. So the Samson myth, right? Samson story is interesting because it essentially, what's it telling you? It's not really telling you anything. Most biblical stories have like a moral or some kind of theological teaching. The Samson story is like, it's an outlier. It's a bit of a weird one until you understand it as a solar myth, right? Which is Samson's hair are the rays of sun. So when Delilah, who represents a moon, cuts the rays of sun, then his power goes and the moon's power rises. But there's some cyclical idea to this. So when you understand that the Samson story is a solar myth, and I'm sure you can find arguments of why it isn't, but I've read some really good stuff that suggests very strongly that that's a solar myth, and it makes sense of that story existing at all, because when you see it in the biblical, it's found its way into the biblical narrative, probably as a leftover part of the cultural journey that these people went on, but it's there without really providing much of a purpose theologically, unless you understand it as a kind of fossilized solar myth. So my point is that there are some interesting parallels that you shouldn't dismiss, but there are some which are like, yeah.
I think you're right about Samson. Even his eyes being gouged out is the idea of blindness or darkness coming, and the cutting of the hair. Now the rays aren't there, darkness, you can't see. So I think winter solstice, that kind of stuff may play a role. Yeah, but when it comes to the New Testament, it's so the stories don't even line up. Like, is the sun going up? Is it going down? When did it? Like, you don't even know what you're looking at because it's 4 different, completely different narratives. But anywho.
So the next issue that we have are Jesus's followers, so the women. So Mark and Matthew, going back to the time of Jesus' arrest, are clear that there are no disciples at the crucifixion, that all of Jesus' disciples forsook him at the cross. So this is that reversal of expectation motif that we see, that a lot of scholars talk about. I know that Carrier's talked about this, I think McDonald as well, which is the idea that what you would expect to happen doesn't happen. So the disciples end up basically forsaking Jesus, running away, and the person that comes to his honor is Joseph of Arimathea, as we talked about last time. This got best, or was that with you that we talked about? Maybe we probably didn't get onto Joseph of Arimathea, so there's another one, but we'll get onto him, which is here's a reversal of expectation motif. It's the person we'd least expect to come and honorably bury Jesus happens to be a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. So what happens to the disciples? They all end up buggering off, and we're left with the woman there. And this isn't, again, fulfilling that sort of reversal of expectation motif. But then Luke 23 confuses matters. So he says, and I quote Luke 23, 48 and 49, and all the crowds who came together for this spectacle, when they observed what had happened, began to return, beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the woman who accompanied him from Galilee were standing at a distance seeing these things. So here we get, like, it comes back to the classic. You know, Matthew, Mark, and John say there's a couple of people here, and Luke says everyone's there. And this idea that the Christians sometimes go, well, a couple of people there is included in everyone, right? So no one's wrong. You know, we say that only this woman's here and that time, but actually one person is included in everyone. So, you know, there's no contradiction. You're like, that's not how we do numbers.
I actually underlined at the bottom, but if I could read that paragraph there as quick as I can. Mark, and this is on page 113 of his book here. Mark has several, and Matthew has many women at a distance from the cross. Luke 23:49 could be seen to also support or contradict this description by nebulously including all his acquaintances being present. John, again, the outlier, takes it one step further and claims that at least one disciple was there, the one whom he loved. Tradition denotes this person as John himself, but who could be, as has been proposed, one or none of the following: Lazarus, Mary Magdalene, James, Jesus' brother, or an unknown priest or follower. Luke could be seen to be harmonizable at a stretch with Mark and Matthew, but John is in plain contradiction. Additionally, John includes Mary, Jesus' mother, present with several other women. John contradicts either all of the other authors or all minus Luke. Luke could be seen to agree with Matthew and Mark or disagree with everyone, essentially saying everyone was there. It's a mess. It would be quite the issue if Luke truly meant that everyone was literally there at the cross. This casts doubts as to either his sources were or those of Mark and Matthew. What another mass of confusion, you say? I think I confused everyone reading.
Yeah. But it's just confusion. It's just like, whoa, how do I make sense of this? Which is, again, to understand that you've got 4 different authors writing at different times and arguably using previous sources, but then making it their own. So they've each got a little bit of change to make or a little bit of difference. or maybe, you know, there's a bit of oral tradition in their community that has some influence on how they are interpreting things, or what the narrative is for them. And you've just got 4 different stories going on.
Yeah.
So there you go. So the woman at the tomb is yet another problem. Then we get on to blood and water, wine and myrrh. So this is where, according to Mark and Matthew, Jesus was given a drink of wine before and then after crucifixion. But in Luke and John, this happens only after the crucifixion. So vinegar is a type of cheap sour wine that he's given. You get this gall or myrrh. Basically, it depends which gospel you read as to what he's given, but some interpretations are that what he's given is a pain reliever, right? That's why he's given these things.
Yeah.
But it's like being crucified. It's like going up to someone on the electric chair and saying, "Oh, I suppose we do that in our modern times because we try and make it as painless as possible." But this for the Romans, this was not. This was the opposite of like a humane.
I was going to say they cast lots for that. They beat the crap out of him. They whip him. They do everything to hurt him. And then they're like staking him up on the stake here, or call it a cross, whatever you want. And then they're like, but we don't want you to suffer.
Yeah,
get out of here. You know what I mean? Like, what the hell?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a bit of weirdness going on there, and it looks like, I mean, I was reading something recently actually that there could be an Old Testament. I need to find that though, so I don't really want to give any details, but it could be an Old Testament reference as to what he's given there. But again, you know, it's just certain things just don't make sense, and again, the dividing of lots. So the next episode we're going to talk about prophecies, right? So I'm not going to talk about the dividing of the clothes, other than to say that they also, like you just said, and like we talked about in the last episode, they scourge him. You know, Passion of Christ, he's covered in blood, and then they're like, yeah, I really want his clothes, let's play a gambling game so you can win his clothes. It's like, who would want this bloody clothes of this guy? It's in Psalm 22. I understand why you want this. Yep. Just a gospel author. Just tick, tick, tick. Here's some Old Testament reference validation for my narrative. So this is validated because what happens here is actually foreshadowed in Psalm 22.
I like how you mentioned too, they continued on from Psalms 22, 23, and 24. You show something. Most Christians just think Psalm 22, and they don't realize mimesis often. They don't care about literary intertextuality being connected here. But if you follow the conclusion, like the narrative comes all the way to a resurrection. When you get into like Psalms 23, 24, there's like, you talk about this briefly in your book, but anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, no, it's a really important part. So that and we'll deal with that separately in probably the next episode, because effectively, a lot of what happens to Jesus looks to be some kind of prophetic foreshadowing, or at the very least validation by using Old Testament references, which are taken out of context and then don't make any sense, being taken out of context and applied to Jesus, like as in, you know, those verses, okay, that single verse might apply to Jesus, but the next ones don't. So that's, but also what you're making Jesus do, or in this case, the guards casting lots, doesn't make sense. Like, what's going on here? Oh, you're just validating Jesus for your Jewish audience, of course. Now, once I understand that, it all starts making sense. So Matthew 27, again, we did talk about this last time, but Matthew 27, we talked about this plenty, in fact, which is earthquake, the renting of the temple veil, darkness, and zombie saints. Again, either Matthew's the only one to have the zombie saints, certainly, and I think he might be the only one to have the earthquake. The other two claims, I think, are in Luke and Matthew as well, and maybe some of the others.
Can I read something I found fascinating? Because we did touch on this, because you talk about it earlier in the book too, briefly. But
I give it a whole chapter.
In page 115, you say, I will, however, add some very pertinent points to my previous discussion. Darkness at death is a common motif throughout religions and history, whether it be Julius Caesar, Krishna in Hinduism, Romulus, Asclepius, Hercules, Alexander the Great, Atreus of Messene. I hope I'm saying that right. Mycenae. Darkness is so often a symbol associated with the death of important people. we also see many precedents being set in the Hebrew Bible, as I set out in my book, The Nativity, A Critical Examination. Jesus had to be a bigger and better than contemporary historical and religious figures, both externally and internally into the Jewish context. Whatever Caesar did, you said this earlier, Jesus could at least do. Moses, Jesus was the new upgrade. And then you go on by quoting Michael J. Alter. Do you want to read that part, or do you want me to?
Yeah. If the darkness was in fact a miracle, the silence from history is equally miraculous. Would it not be common sense to expect the Greeks, Romans, the Chinese, or others to have noticed and reported such darkness occurring at the time of the month when a solar eclipse was impossible? There is no historical evidence that this astronomical event occurred. So again, this goes back to what we talked about in the first episode, which is the absence from silence argument. Yeah. So the absence of evidence is evidence of absence when you would expect it, right? We would expect people to have talked about the darkness, the earthquake, the zombies parading around Jerusalem, and the temple veil being ripped in two, right? No one mentions this anywhere outside the gospel, and even some of the gospel authors don't mention some of these claims. So what we have is that didn't happen. Like, the most rational conclusion to take here is that those things didn't happen. But especially when and we know they didn't happen, because or at least we can very probably say they didn't happen, because we say that at exactly the same instances in other contexts. So when Julius Caesar died, there wasn't darkness. None of us believe that. Historians don't believe that. Some of the contemporaneous historians might, because they were A, superstitious, and B, had their own agendas. They might have been pro-Caesar, and so therefore, you know, they themselves feel the significance of the event. But essentially, we don't believe any of these claims when they're applied to someone else. Why the heck should we believe it when applied to Jesus?
Right. I agree with you. And you talk about the temple veil, how massive it really was. Holy crap. There, we're going to get to a quote that I definitely highlighted, but you said there are a number of non-biblical accounts of phenomena concerning the curtain. And this is the point I was going to bring up, that you got to get this freaking book. I'm telling you. You see, like, you see the stains on it? That's me eating and then touching this cover, you know?
Nice.
Anyway, there are a number of non-biblical accounts of phenomena concerning the curtain, such as Titus. Now, listen up, everybody who wants to believe in these interesting narratives in the Bible. A Roman general, Titus, entering the Holy of Holies, slashing the curtain, supposedly causing blood to miraculously spurt out. In this case, we rightfully do not believe this of Titus. No one does. But I don't know why not. Why don't we believe it? I mean, if we're willing to grant the Gospels, we're willing to grant what's going on in the New Testament, why aren't we reading Josephus and these other historians and say, you know, that happened?
Because it goes back to confirmation bias. And when I talk, someone in the comments said, thank you to me for talking about garbage in, garbage out. So I use Bayes' theorem in assessing probabilities and the likelihood of different hypotheses being true against each other. But of course, if you're putting garbage into your function machine, you're going to get garbage out. So if you're saying, well, the Gospels are just superb evidence, like the sources are just tremendously good quality sources, then you're much more than the probability that you'll get out of the function machine once you put that into it is going to be far higher than people like us who say, well, actually these are poor levels of evidence. Mm-hmm. So therefore the data is poor and the prior probability is poor. So you are not rational in believing this. But the Christian will say, I'm rational in believing this because the level of evidence and the value I ascribe to the Gospels is superb.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't want to take too much time on that. I know we've been going for a minute too, and it didn't even feel like we were going this long. But yeah, are we talking about what Jesus said?
So then we've got. I mean, we can just if we're a bit under the cosh. So this is famously, like everyone knows, that what Jesus said when he died is different in the Gospels, right? And they all disagree. And you just have an idea that they are all presenting different ways of understanding Jesus' death and presenting their own theology and their own understanding.
Yeah, so some of the Christian scholars, what he's trying to say in this book on page 118, I really enjoyed, was Bishop E.J. Tinsley. And then also the next one, I believe, is a German priest and New Testament scholar, Rudolf Schnackenberg. Yeah, he pretty much is trying to say, well, look, okay, these contradictions, okay, really, Jesus on the cross is like a symbol for the church and you being close to God. Like, I'm really giving a horrible analogy, but he says they are standing by the cross, apparently near Jesus. Whether this is historically probable, hint, I see problems in this, he's saying, since the guard would scarcely allow spectators to approach so closely, does not worry the evangelist. He is concerned with the deeper meaning of the scene. Oh, wow.
Exactly. So it doesn't matter the fact that no one could stand nearby and overhear conversations and overhear what Jesus was saying. So realistically, the only source to these is a guard, who is just a Roman dude. Like, it could be a source, but again, it's so problematic. And then if it's just the guard standing by, why do we have so many different accounts of what Jesus said? Surely we should, or maybe there were 4 guards and each guard gave a different interview to a different gospel author who was writing 40 to 90 years after Jesus died to get their information. What's more likely, that the gospel writers made up what Jesus said, or that these are accurate representations of what Jesus said, but somehow 4 different accounts, like the 4 newspaper accounts?
Yeah. Love it.
So then we get on to the Roman soldier and the breaking of the legs and piercing the sides. Again, we've covered that a little bit with the John Pascal Lamb scenario, but also we'll talk about that in terms of prophecies, because that is all about the prophecies and the Old Testament verses. So should we finish up today with Judas?
I was going to say, there is something in this with Judas that absolutely, I want to say this is probably one of the most clear, that are easy to digest contradictions. I think Moshe should join us in this conversation in terms of the comments. I'm not saying join us on the live here, but Moshe, I want you to hear this, my friend. I know you've not been listening to me and you've been debating people in the chat the whole time, because obviously who cares what we're saying, right? But here in this book, 119, really got to get it if you're interested in considering what skeptics say. On the other hand, so let me just read it. Let me just read what we got here. I don't see any point in why we don't. Judas betrayed Jesus, and he is definitely a figure of blame and disgrace in the story. However, what happened with Judas is thoroughly contradictory. Matthew 27, 3-5 has Judas repenting, casting his money down at the temple, leaving and going to hang himself. Pause. I want anyone who's watching this video, as this video is recorded and saved on YouTube, to remember Judas is guilty. He's so sorry. He repents. He throws his money down at the temple. There's no money. He throws it down. He's done, right? And he's repented. On the other hand, in Acts, with many people thinking Acts was written by the same author as the Gospel, Luke does not have him repent. He doesn't repent. Has him buying a field. So what did he do? He threw the money down, walked away, was repentant, then went back and picked the money up off the ground to go buy a field? I mean, when do you draw a line in your head and say, okay, I'll grant that. I realize that he threw away the money, but in this account, he goes and buys a field with it. Interesting. So I just love this. The headlong, him falling headlong. He goes on and he buys this field. So it's important that price of wickedness, though. So that's a quote. So he buys a field, quote, with the price of wickedness. So it is. There's a real different feel. One, he repents and throws the money down. The other, he's taking the money and with the price of his wickedness is buying this field or farm, depending on how it's translated. Right. But yeah, carry on. Both theological, obviously. But the interesting part is when he hangs himself and he falls headlong, okay, where he burst open in the middle, and all his intestines gushed out. All in Jerusalem presumably knew this incident, and it became known to all the residents of the temple. There is no element of Judas choosing his own end here, as he dies by an act of God. This represents a huge shift in theology and philosophy. Yet again, we have a claim of this, as according to Acts, being an event to fulfill scripture, prophecy in Acts 1:16. Brethren, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit foretold by the mouth of David concerning Judas, who became a guide to those who arrested Jesus. Acts 1 then states, and it became known to all who were living in Jerusalem, so that in their own language, that field was called Hakeldama, that is field of blood.
Yeah, so what you have is two completely different incidents happening. One, Judas hangs himself, and in another, he falls headfirst and his intestines explode. So you get Christians saying, well, this could be the same story. So he could hang himself, and then a branch could break, but then how does he fall head first? Like, if you hang yourself, you fall feet first. I mean, and then your guts don't just explode out of your body, and then because of that, this is called the field of blood. Actually, so this is called something called name etiology. So etiology is something that happens a lot in the Bible. Actually, it happens a huge amount. So, for example, Sodom and Gomorrah, you get the idea that the pillar of salt, it explains these salty area around the Dead Sea. So it's not just this story to do with God, punishing someone for looking around. There's etiology going on there, which is explanation often of geographical areas and how they get their name or how they get their what they look like or whatever. So in this situation, you've got the gospel author saying, or the author in Acts saying that this is how that field got its name, except it's pretty much almost certainly not how it got its name. It got its name because it was near the temple, and they would have fertilized the field with the blood from the sacrificial lambs and so on and so forth. So it's just
kind of like people who are going to go to the valley of Gehenna being a place of hell. We know that's a possible trash dump, they say, that could have been a potential trash dump outside of Jerusalem. And they're like, they burn trash there. Well, that fire never goes out day or night, and it's a symbol of an after. Anyway, Nikolai Dimov said, thank you for the super chat. He says, Judas probably symbolizes Israel and Judah as a betrayer. And here's the thing. I don't think he's far off from that in many respects, because if you look at the Joseph narrative in the Hebrew Bible, and you just kind of not getting into the documentary hypothesis there when he sells off Joseph, Judas, Judah was the one who had the idea of selling him. And his brother, I can't remember which one it was, Simeon, I can't remember who the brother was. I could be wrong about the name here. One of the brothers wanted to kill him. And then it was really Judah that said, look, let's sell him. Let's not have his blood on our hands. Let's sell him off. And he does. And they get 20 shekels, I think. In the New Testament, it's 30. But it's a narrative. The point is, this is a story. No reason to believe this historically.
Good point. Such a good point. I didn't include that in my book. Wish I had. But yeah, it absolutely makes a whole heap of sense.
Oh, on top of that, something interesting, just because we're wrapping up on Judas, and I really love your book that you might have liked. I don't know if you thought about this. When Joseph gets sold into slavery in Potiphar's home, his wife tries to sleep with him, and he gets put over. It says he's the overseer of the dungeon, if you will, the prison in Pharaoh's Egypt's prison. Yeah. He's in charge. He hears two guys who have dreams. I've said this to Dr. Price, and me and him wrote an article in the Journal of Higher Criticism on this whole thing.
Nice.
He heard two men's dreams. One's a baker and one is a wine bearer.
Yeah.
Hint, do you see the imagery here? The wine and the bread? And here's what happens. He tells both of them the interpretation of their dreams. And he says to the one, in 3 days from now, he literally says 3 days, you will be reestablished as the wine bearer for Pharaoh. And to the baker, he says in 3 days, your head will be on a pike and the birds will eat the flesh off your skin. Okay. And what happens according to the narrative is in 3 days, sure enough, Joe Schmo gets his head off. Joe Schmo ends up at the right hand. And while he's leaving the dungeon, he says to the wine bearer, hey, don't forget about me. What does Jesus say? Do this in remembrance of me. Okay. It's brilliant. All narrative. And it's beautiful when you see that.
Yeah. But that's what I said to you last time, which is when you start reading these as a secular person who's interested in the illusions that are made between the intertextuality.
Right.
I've literally got goosebumps, right? Because because I don't believe any of the Bible as
I
being
love it though.
historically true.
Yeah,
But I love the fact that meaning it can be derived. Like if that, I mean, it might not be true. It might just be a fluke, right? But man, that's awesome of the gospel author to go through and take that story and weave that and tell it into this new story about Jesus, so that hopefully your Jewish audience that know that story inside out, that Joseph, that's one of their main sort of oral traditions, probably, as well as a written tradition, that they then that's lighting up their brain. They're hearing this and they're like, yes, I get this, I get this, I get this.
It is powerful.
I love that.
It's beautiful myth making, and I really do appreciate it for that. But the historical position is ridiculous to me. Dina Fash, thank you for the super chat, my friend. I seriously appreciate it. Remember, once someone is painted into a corner over this, they respond, it's Satan. Satan changed history. Satan had evidence destroyed. Satan changed minds, etc., etc. Great show. Just purchased the book. Well, Dina, I hope I'm saying that right. Dina, I hope I'm saying that. Please. I've got like 4 at least episodes I'd like to do with Jonathan. We ended on page 120 for those who are watching right now. We are starting off on page 121, and the title, my camera's kind of blurry. I'm messing up here. Let me get it right. Prophecies. Page 121 is where we're going to pick up on the next episode.
The chapter is called Prophecies, Scrabbling Back in Time to Prove the Present.
Yes, and if you can read up to there, that's fine. If you don't get the first 120 pages, I do recommend going through it, because there's a lot we didn't talk about that he wrote about. But I think the shows suffice on carrying you to this point. Yeah. So if you do pick it up, start on 120. We still got a pretty good chunk to go. I think the book is about almost 300, over 300 pages. So
can I just say to Dinner, who talked about Satan, people in the corner saying Satan, and I said this in the very last episode, that of course God outsources the services he doesn't want to do to Satan. If you believe in a literal Satan, and you also believe that God is omnipotent, God could get rid of Satan like that. So the fact that Satan still exists is at the will, even if it's the omissive will, so God lets it happen rather than makes it happen. If God lets it happen, it is still God's will. So everything that Satan does is at the will of God. So there is absolutely no way a Christian can ever lay any negative aspect at Satan's feet that doesn't ultimately fall at God's feet.
And you know what? The 100%. Ultimate answer from Paul would be on that is, and you could point it to God. And Paul's response is, who do you think you are? You piece of clay. You know, I had a guy actually say that on one of my episodes the other day.
I'm made in the image of God, so I think I'm there you go.
You're in his image, but you're made of clay. Like that was literally one of the people in the comments. I think they were coming from this and they were upset at what I was saying or what someone was saying on my channel. I looked at it and they were talking about, oh, look at these pieces of clay talking like they know.
I think that person should probably read the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish and the Mesopotamian creations, and then come back to us and talk about clay, because it looks like that's been stolen from cultures that were surrounding the historical sort of Israelite country. So yeah, and it's like the Garden of Eden. I mean, you've done all this with Josh and other eminent scholars, but when you look at the Garden of Eden, the tree of life, the serpents, even even the rib, you can look, and the clay, you can look to the cultures, the Mesopotamian cultures surrounding the biblical societies, and find that all those creation myths have their genesis in outside of the area. So,
I think you're right, and that's the most sense that I make. The intertextuality there is clear, and I like it. That's why I do what I do. I still love it, looking at it in an entirely different way. But it has no epistemic or ontological, like, it doesn't have any weight on me or any bearing on my life in that respect. It's literature now. And I've actually, they talk about, they demythologize the Mesopotamian myth, and they bring God and they make God this. Well, I've done that with the Bible now, and realizing what it actually is in literature. It's men writing. There is no woo woo. Oh God, the spirit made this thing. Like, I'm out of that. I'm not
Yeah.
in that anymore. But I'm looking for connections and stuff.
As I've said to you plenty in the last episode. So my trilogy started with the Nativity book. That one's a lot thinner because the Nativity doesn't have nearly as much narrative about it. It only appears in 2 Gospels. So that started the ball rolling. Then that came. Then along came the Resurrection, and I'm now writing the Exodus, a critical examination of the Moses story. And what's fascinating in writing that is all the historical connections that you can make between these other cultures. And like you say, once you understand the intertextuality, and once you understand where and why the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was written, or the Torah in particular, when and why that was written and where, and talking about being in exile in Babylonia, then you can start appreciating it even more, and you understand why certain stories were included, and you understand why things are in there, and it makes it such a richer reading experience. If you are going at it as a hyperliteral Christian or Jew, and you're saying what I'm reading is 100% true, it's inerrant, and it has absolutely no predecessor, so it doesn't dip into or allude to any other sources, then you are doing something to that text that you would never do to any other text. You would never take a text out of context and say this just sits on its own as a hyperliteral correct text. All texts are in context, and once you understand the context, then it makes the reading experience so much richer.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm also doing that with the Quran right now. I'm trying to go and look for literary intertextuality and borrowing from other places. So there's so much to do here. Page 121. I posted the link to the book, The Resurrection,
Thanks,
a critical examination of the Easter story. Really interested in going through this. We probably have, I'd say, 3 or 4 more episodes as long as we can make all of this content get covered. And then I do want to get into the Nativity book. You also sent me here. Let me see. Where's that?
I sent you 4 books, but only 1 arrived. So
yeah,
thanks UPS.
Yeah.
Hey ho. But I sent you the little book of unholy questions, which is 501 questions I asked God. And you know what? Almost 10 years later, and she hasn't answered one of them. Not one. So there you go. Thanks.
We're going to go through books. We're going to go through books, ladies and gentlemen. Seriously, appreciate you. This book is fun, man, and it's not too complex. It's very layman. Most people can get it, and you're quoting some serious scholars. And just listening to the quotes you bring up of Richard Carrier makes me excited about seeing him next week, because he's a sharp mofo, dude. I mean, this guy is definitely very sharp.
So people have varying opinions about Richard Carrier, for whether they sit on the historicist side or the mythicist side, or for whatever reasons, for whatever historical reasons. But what is absolutely without doubt, and I worked quite closely with Richard Carrier on certain elements of the book, is that he has an encyclopedic knowledge about all things resurrection. He really, really does, and he was really helpful, particularly, as I said to you before, particularly with the death, the execution and the death, and the Jewish laws involved in that. Because I actually changed my mind on any good skeptic should, when they are presented with good evidence. So I used to think that like John Dominic Crossan, that Jesus was left to rot on the cross and be picked at by carrion. And now I don't believe that. So I believe he would have been taken down by a pious Jew, because actually they definitely didn't like dead people being hung up after sunsets. And you can see that in Jewish law. So he would have been taken down, but he just wouldn't have been put in an empty tomb. That's the bit that doesn't jive. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. There's so much. If you're a Patreon member, like I showed at the beginning, I'm going to go and pop this back up one more time. If you guys are Patreon members, you can, did I pop it up? No, I did not. Add to stream. That might help. You guys can join, ask questions. I'll go interview scholars. Right over here is my messages. I've got one message right now I need to check. If it's a question to a scholar, any particular scholar I visit, you guys are more than welcome to send those questions. And these are the videos asked of Patreon. Most of these are actually from Patreon members. So you get like a specific video with your name, like it's made for you. You're asking it to these experts, and it goes on. The list goes on. I load more pop up if it'll load. I don't know why it takes so long when I'm doing lives. Maybe it's the internet. Also, go check out his blog. He's got the blog here, A Tippling Philosopher. That's all in the description. And he also has a YouTube channel. Go subscribe to his YouTube channel, help grow that channel. He's interviewed Dr. Joshua Bowen, and he plans on, I think, having me on one day.
Yeah. Hopefully fairly soon, actually, because I don't do enough on my YouTube channel because just too busy, basically. And it's like too many fingers and too many pies. But it is something I would like to nurture. And I'd love to have you on to talk about your own personal experiences of deconversion. I think it'd be fascinating.
Awesome. Well, I'd be happy to do that, man. Just let me know. Everybody, if you want to help support, you know the ways you could do it. Seriously, until next time, we're going to continue. What are we going to stop at? Have you decided where we're going to stop? Maybe to let our audience know when they're reading along with the book?
No, but that prophecy one should be quite a big one. We'll definitely do prophecies, Joseph of Arimathea, and then it starts getting onto the death and burial, that's a big old set of stuff because there's quite a bit of unpicking to do about how Jesus would have been crucified or would have been executed, because I don't think he would have been crucified, actually.
Okay, so do you want to do just chapters 11 and 12?
11, 12, and maybe 13.
Maybe 13. You let me know. So everybody who wants to get ahead of it, they can, and be ready for the episode. And you guys can be in the chat, like rooting us on and you know, saying things, all that. Yeah, that's fun. Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to it, man. Seriously. It won't be next week because I'll be in California. With Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Dr. Carrier, and I'll be with them all week. So
sounds awesome.
Cool deal, brother.
That's like nerd paradise.
It seriously is. I'm excited. I can't tell you how excited I am. I just need to get more questions made up now, so I'm not like on the spot coming up with the ideas that I've read from their books and stuff. I want to have Patreon members see the production and go, holy crap, man, I've got a couple videos in my name, you know, where he asks my question, and Richard Carrier or Dennis McDonald or both, because I want to get videos with both of them. Like on the one video, have both seated, and here I am interviewing two guys. Nobody's ever done that, so I want to try and like make history with that. Yeah,
that'd be brilliant. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you. I'm going live here in a minute. I don't know if it's a live or pre-recorded. I'm not really sure. On Gnostic Informant's channel, I'm going to share it in my community tab on MythVision right here on YouTube, also on Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Come check me out. Come hang out with us. Love you guys, and never forget, we are MythVision.